Well, you see, the word responsible, it's in the word, response. Able. You have to be able to respond. Part of what moral responsibility is.
Well, but it's the nature of the procession. If you proceed from the source that is a father, then you must be a son and an only son. It's the nature of a procession. Have you ever heard the word procession? Have you paid heed to the prefix pro in the word procession?
This is gonna be stuff like that. Like
But just to go even further beyond. This isn't even my final song.
Because it seems to me that it doesn't logically follow to say that because we know God exists, therefore God is epistemically necessary. I mean, God could give us a variety of different types of knowledge or propositions that we know, but it wouldn't follow that therefore our ability to perceive and understand the external world is dependent upon that knowledge. See, for something in Romans 1, which could be used to show that we wouldn't be able to understand the external world to the extent that we do unless we have this knowledge of God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. Totally, yeah. So I think I would want to maybe just briefly run through the couple verses that your average revelational epistemologist is going to use.
Okay.
And probably heard it 1,000 times, but just really quick. This is starting in verse 18 of the first chapter. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they, became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. And it goes on to describe a lot of what Paul means by those dishonorable passions. But I think from the perspective that Paul's motivation here is sort of a universal indictment of mankind, that Paul is bringing forth to bear the fact that people are born with knowledge of God, and that their entire lives are shaped, if you will, by the fact that they are in covenant with Adam, that therefore they're born into sin, and they're going to be judged for that on the final day. And so it's not very explicit in Romans 1, but I guess if I had to pick a verse that really points out the fact that this is a matter of epistemic necessity, it's the verse 21, where it says, For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And interpreting that in light of the rest of Romans and Paul's basic motivation here to say, look, the gospel is for everyone because everyone's a sinner, everyone's turned from God. They're rebels who suppress the knowledge that they have of God. this universal indictment, as the reformers want to call it. Interpreting verse 21 in that way, I think it's saying that the entirety of one's life is shaped in this covenantal way, is shaped in the fact that we're born into sin, we're born in Adam's covenant, and therefore that affects even our intellectual lives. Like even our thinking becomes futile in the fact that we're rebelling against this God.
Okay,
So
maybe we could. I want to focus in on that verse, but let's really like focus in on what it means to say that our thinking becomes futile. Because when I hear that, I think our thinking becomes useless in a sense. It's unable to achieve, require, or actualize the desired result. But what is it? What do you think it means to say that our thinking? Well, those who suppress the truth is futile. What exactly does that mean?
So I don't know the exact Greek word, but I think that the general idea is that it is self-defeating, right? Like the basic idea is of someone who is, it's like Sisyphus, right? You're pushing a rock up a hill just to have it roll down on the other side. It's behavior that is undoing of itself in the very act of attempting to do it.
Yeah.
Right. It's like it's shooting yourself in your foot, kind of.
Right. Well, the way I usually approach the Bible, no matter what topic I'm looking at, is I think, I'll think about my interpretation, and I think to myself, would this verse make sense? Would it be meaningful if my interpretation were false? And so with this verse right here, although they knew not God, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. Let's just take that part in isolation. If God is not epistemically necessary, would that verse be meaningless? Would it be? Would it not convey any meaningful information to the reader? Because it seems to me that it would, regardless of whether God is epistemically necessary. And then we'll take the next part of the verse and just proceed that way.
Sure. No, I think I would grant you that if you how to put it.
All it's saying really is that they know that God exists and they're not acknowledging it. But that, of course, that sure. Doesn't tell us anything about. Obviously, that doesn't tell us whether their knowledge of God is the very foundation of their daily lives, the behaviors that we all engage in, our reliability of induction, things like that. We couldn't obviously infer just based on those words that God is epistemically necessary. But it seemed like you wanted to narrow in on the part about our thinking becoming futile. It seems to me like if there's a sense in which that could make sense, even if God is not epistemically necessary. Our thinking it's not up to the task of glorifying God. We're thinking in ways that are against our own self-interest. They are contrary to the goals that we should aspire to. And in that sense, our thinking is futile. But does it follow that because our thinking is futile due to a suppression of the truth, does it logically follow from that therefore God is epistemically necessary? Therefore, we wouldn't be able to reason or make sense of the world without him. I don't see how that exactly follows. Do you get where I'm coming from?
Yeah. I guess it's like I don't want to ask leading questions, but at the same time, it wants me. It inspires me to ask, how could you make? Let's suppose that our reasoning becomes useless. That we don't aspire to the goals of reasoning that we should, given that we're suppressing knowledge of God, according to Paul. Okay. Is that synonymous with saying, and is it possible not to then conclude or infer that includes as part of its meaning that one is irrational in case one is living in this way, that one is irrational in case one is suppressing knowledge of God, and therefore being reduced to futility in thinking.
If we define rationality in terms of behaviors and their correspondence to the actions that we should take in order to fulfill our normative duties, then yes. But I don't think that generally people use the word rationality that way. I mean, for example, like there's a lot of disagreement about what types of behaviors are moral or immoral. And I don't generally assume that because somebody disagrees with me about whether something is moral or whether they ought to behave that way, I don't assume that they're irrational if somebody has an incorrect opinion or view as to how they ought to act, because a lot of times it's very complicated and it's very difficult to determine what the correct course of action is.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
So I mean, I guess in a sense, I could maybe for the sake of argument, I could grant that it is irrational. If I grant that it is irrational to according to the Bible, of course, everything we're talking about is based on the correct interpretation of the text. So if Romans 1 properly understood is that people are behaving irrationally for not acknowledging the God of the Bible, where does that get us in terms of determining whether Romans 1 is actually telling us that belief in God is epistemically necessary?
Yeah, so I think I'm glad you hit on the what definition of rationality are we using, basically, right? Like,
yeah,
that's definitely a controversial subject. I think to hit on both the things you said there, to answer the second question first, I think if you are left with thinking improperly, if you're left with irrationality as a result of suppressing some state of knowledge, right? Not acknowledging beliefs such that you are then futile in your thinking, I think that would constitute epistemic necessity, right? Like, what would it mean? What would epistemic necessity mean if not that you could not be rational without living in accord, without thinking in accord, without acknowledging some mental state that has to do with belief, knowledge?
Well, I could go back to the definition, or I don't know if I want to confine it to saying it's a definition, but what you said, sorry, let me pull up the text I had before. You said that, okay, I'm just going to go by memory. In your discussion with Alex, you said that
Sure.
It's epistemically necessary so far as that means that you need to believe in it in order to make sense of the world around you. That seems to be slightly different from saying that you need to believe in it in order to be rational. But I can see where the overlap might be.
Yeah, well, I think again, it depends somewhat on how you're viewing futility.
See, the way I interpreted your words, I guess I kind of interpreted your words through the lens of like Greg Bonson or someone like that, where he uses like examples. Like, are you familiar with his toothpaste example of like the atheist is he has no reason to trust when he does these tasks that he does every day, and he has no legitimate reason to trust that that when he tries to put the toothpaste on the toothbrush, that it's going to go the way it has every day in the past, and things like that. Like those kinds of behaviors that non-believers engage in all the time, of trusting things that we might not have any good reason to trust in, absent a belief in this creator God. That's how I kind of interpreted your words when you were talking about Romans 1, where it's like, unless you acknowledge this natural revelation, your behavior is inconsistent with, I guess, your own worldview, in a sense. But I may have misinterpreted.
No, I think that's a good analogy, right? And so Bonson's basically saying, look, um, the only rational basis that you have for inductive pursuits is this worldview that you have, is this uh, belief centered on Christian revelation, right? Your knowledge of God.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I think that in terms of Romans 1, the key thing again is that Paul is looking at this from a covenantal perspective. So he's interpreting human beings, usually later in like Romans 5. He's interpreting human beings in terms of their being born to the covenant of Adam, the entirety of their life. So it's not just an intellectual issue, but it does encompass all of your intellectual enterprises. And the other thing is that the result is that they have these evil passions, that they have this futility, and God gives them over to it. God allows them to reap what they sow, basically.
Right.
So I apologize. I'm getting off on a tangent there a little bit, but to go back and answer your question, yeah, I think futility and the fact that the person is living in a way that is against the truth of the matter, right? That they are reduced to irrationality. That's not to make the same argument that Bonson is making, but I think it's hugely implicatory. Like if you have idea without which you're reduced to living and thinking in futility, that's how would that not imply epistemic necessity? I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
To use just to use your own method of interpretation, I wouldn't know how to make sense of that verse if not included in that meaning, if not if not preeminent in that verse, but at least included in it is, oh hey, wait a second. So then we need God to be rational. Like we couldn't be rational apart from knowledge of Him.
Well, the thing is, I mean, if we're going to talk about, let's go back to that verse. Let me just pull it up again.
Sure.
Verse 21, you said it was? Okay, so about their thinking becoming futile. I don't know exactly what that means. It seems like there are a variety of possible interpretations. It could mean that their thinking is not in correspondence, it's not in accordance with God's will. And if that is all Paul is saying, then rationality need not factor into it at all. Would you agree? Because it seems like somebody could disagree with God's will. They could desire an outcome that is contrary to God's will, and it wouldn't necessarily be irrational to do so. What do you think about that?
That's an excellent question, and that goes back to the controversy about rationality. I would say I don't think so, because I think from a Pauline perspective, like from the to the Hebraic mind and to the Jewish mind, wisdom begins with fear of the Lord. Wisdom is something that God gives to man, and it's inherently wrapped up in both knowledge, both in one's epistemology as well as ethics and how one lives one's life. So I don't think that from Paul's perspective, I think he would be very confused if we had a definition of rationality that made this dichotomy between how you ought to live your life versus thinking in a way that is successful.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I've talked to a lot of Christians who take the view that when you get into strict issues of normativity, you have to sort of factor out rationality, because you can always posit, what if you have somebody who wants to go to hell, he wants to experience separation from God. why is it irrational for him to disobey everything that God says if those are the goals that he aspires to?
Mhm.
And you could say, oh well, he would be much less happy in separation from God as opposed to unity with God. But I don't know. What would you say to that question?
It would. It's so I at the front of that, because it's hard to answer that question without giving you theology as opposed to like exposition of the text.
Yeah.
So I'll try to get back to the exposition of the text as fast as I can. The theological answer is, well, because I think it's true that people do, in a sense, want hell, that we are born actually desiring to run away from God, to rebel against him. But from a Pauline anthropology, like from a biblical anthropology, human beings want to create idols. And so the issue is not that we just want no God. The issue is that we want everything that is good in God without God himself. So we want to substitute God. We want to create idols. We want to replace God with whatever it is that we want to do it with.
Yeah.
And that's exactly, I think, what's coming up as a result when Paul says, for this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. So I know somewhere there's the word unnatural used here. Debased mind. Here it is, yeah. Because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the creator. Right? There's a replacement theology, if you will. There.
Yeah.
And so I think the whole point about dishonorable passions. There's some. I'm not seeing it with my eyes. I know that some texts translate an adjective here, unnatural, and the whole point of that is humans were designed to worship God, to love and to be pleased in total contentness by who God is and his presence with us, but we're not, because we're sinners. Like, we're born into sin, and so now we try to find that pleasure that we would have in God by replacing him, by substituting him.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I guess I would just disagree with the Christians who are trying to make the dichotomy between normativity and rationality there. Like, I think because our cognitive faculties are designed in the garden with the intent of, look, you're a creature that's built with the major joy buttons in your brain for deity, for Yahweh, and now you're so twisted and disconnected from God that you and I, being born into the world as a sinner, act against that, right? And that's the futility of it. That's the shooting yourself in the footness of it. Is human beings by nature were built to do it. We're built to think that way and to enjoy God that way, and that's what sin has done. Is it's corrupted that and twisted it, and now we're trying to find that joy in something else besides God.
Yeah. But to say that because we're built a particular way, that therefore we're obligated to behave that way, irrespective of our own values or desired circumstances, it seems to leave no rational reason for the non-believer who desires separation from God, to actually behave in ways that would bring about salvation, or his own salvation, or that would conduce to God's goals or God's desired circumstances, if you know what I mean. I don't know. But
So,
going back to... Oh, go ahead.
Not to get off on a tangent, but just to follow you up on that. So it's almost like the unbeliever could just say, well, okay, so what? This is actually what I want. Like, God could never be in a position.
Yeah, and if that is what he wants, then what is irrational about behaving in ways that conduce to what he wants, which is
right,
just neglecting God's laws and his statutes. I don't know. I'll have to think about this some more.
Sure.
But I mean, going back to Romans 1, if all Paul is saying is that our thinking is futile with respect to God's goals and not our own, then you're saying that might, if that's what Paul is saying, then that could create some potential problems, because it leaves the non-believer in a position of not having any real rational reason to behave according to God's will. Whereas if Paul is talking about our thinking being futile in a more broad sense, in a sense that applies to us and our own lives and our own well-being and our own interests, then it makes more sense. Therefore, your interpretation makes more sense, because it precludes those potential problems. I don't know if I'm making much sense right now. I'm just trying to think out loud as to what you're saying.
Totally. Yeah. No, and I think I think that's it's unclear. Like, what does Jimmy mean when he's saying like that Paul has a covenant idea in mind, and it's involving all of a person's life. Like, what does that have to do with epistemic necessity? What does that have to do with transcendental necessity? But I think that's exactly the point. Is like, maybe to use, and not, I hope I'm not muddying the issue, but to introduce another form of language, more psychological, things that define you. We're talking about one's ultimate intellectual commitment. So the very seat or ground motive of human life is related to God.
Right.
Yeah, and so I think for Paul, like, and for any person who is a covenant theologian, which obviously I'm working under the assumption that the biblical authors all are covenant theologians. You are born basically everyone is born into a relationship with God. The problem is you're either born into the covenant of Christ, and therefore you love God, you worship him, you hold him as your king and your father, and so on and so forth, or you're born into the covenant of Adam, and that means you're a rebel, and that's rebel of the mind, not just rebel of a school and all that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I have a better understanding of how you interpret this verse. I don't know. I don't entirely agree with it, but it seems to me, I guess, that if I were Paul and I wanted to communicate to the readers that you could not function as a human being, you could not live your life the way you do now, unless you believed this. It seems like Paul could have done a much better job of communicating that in much less ambiguous terms. But that's just me, and I kind of have that same sentiment with regard to every single issue that Christians disagree with, whether it's soteriology or anything else. Pretty much whatever position a Christian holds, I look at the biblical support for that, and I say, I see where you're coming from, but I could have made it a lot more clear, such that people aren't disagreeing with it at every turn. But that's just kind of beside the point, I guess.
I mean, what's funny is, to give credence to that, Chad, this verse with Peter, where he's like, some of Paul's sayings are just really hard to understand. So
right.
The biblical authors agree with you, like Paul, sometimes you're not very clear what you're talking about. Just to be clear, I would suggest that this is the focus of Paul's writing here. I don't think Paul's trying to make some kind of apologetic argument. All I'm saying is, I think the etymology he's working with, I think your method of interpreting is actually exactly right. Like, can you make sense of what Paul's saying without following him in what I take to be his assumption that God is epistemically necessary? And I would say, I don't think so. How do you make sense of futility without God in a non-presuppositional?
Well, because if in Paul's mind the only thing that really matters is what God wants, irrespective of what we desire, God's purpose for humanity is all that matters in the mind of Paul. And he might not be thinking in terms of like whether we have a categorical imperative or a hypothetical imperative to obey God's laws, that might have not even broached the mind of Paul as he was writing this, but just it makes sense to me for Paul to say that our thinking is futile, in the sense that our thinking is not, it is not up to the standards of God, and is not, it does not conduce to God's will or his desire for humanity. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's futile for me as a non-believer, that I'm behaving irrationally or in ways that contradict my own worldview. I just think I have to read into the text a little bit to derive that, but that's my own view, and I could be wrong.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. Up to you. I would definitely go up with more challenge about whether or not that interpretation can follow, or we can.
Yeah, well, yeah, if you have any thoughts, and we can always talk about this again. I hope we can have more conversations in the future, because I'm really enjoying this so far.
Same here, Chad. It's nice to have conversations with people like you and Alex, where you're not only are you very bright, but you're also extremely civil, and there's just a nice there's an interest in the topic, right? It's not just like, oh, we're here to debate and
right.
an argument.
Yeah. This really doesn't have to be a battle of the worldviews, and I prefer when it's
Right.
not. And that's one of the things I would say the exact same thing about you. I've watched a lot of your hangouts. I really enjoy. The first one I listened to was the Supping with Presuppers one, and I'm like, wow, this guy is not like any presuppositionalist I've ever heard. Your arguments are different. Your method of conversing with people is different. It's a lot more. I wish more of them were like you in that respect. But yeah, there was another thing I wanted to touch on, and that was the ability of something like natural revelation to sort of, I guess, justify some of the presuppositions that we all kind of adhere to. So, like, I'd be curious to know whether you think that the natural revelation we read about in Romans 1 would be sufficient grounds on which to justify the belief in the reliability of induction, for example. Because, I mean, presumably, it doesn't logically follow that because God has maintained a consistent cosmos in the past, that therefore he'll continue to do so in the future. I mean, even if I grant, for the sake of argument, that our knowledge of God is an essential component of intelligibility that we acquire through some sort of natural revelation, wouldn't we still need something more than that, like say the Bible, in order to know that God will maintain that continuity in the future? I mean, I've heard presuppositionalists use this argument against deists, who try to say that, well, look, my epistemic foundation is on the same ground as yours. I believe in a God, and that this God maintains the world as we see it. But usually what the presuppositionalist says is that, yeah, well, has this God revealed to you that he's going to maintain the future as he's done in the past? And it seems like you would need something more than natural revelation. You would need an actual guarantee from this God that, look, you can expect continuity in the future. I'm just curious whether you think that the natural revelation of Romans 1 covers all of the presuppositions, whether that justifies all of the presuppositions we make, including like induction, or whether it's just a select few presuppositionalists that it covers. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So part of the difficulty in answering that is that I'm basically answering, okay, how do God's two forms of revelation, natural revelation and special revelation, conceptually relate to each other? Yeah. And as someone who's not a Clarkian, as someone who's in the Van Tilian camp, I think that they presuppose each other in a way that basically means you're not going to have you're going to have that kind of futility that Paul's talking about in Romans 1, something like it, I guess. If you don't have both together, they're sort of designed to supplement each other.
Okay.
So
How does natural revelation presuppose special revelation?
That's an excellent question. So Voss, not Van Til, but Voss is actually the genius who sort of brought about this sort of thinking. And Van Til is wont to note that in his Defense of the Faith, for example, when he points out that in the garden, man was presented with a special revelation already. Like human beings, Adam and Eve, are in the garden. They're surrounded by God's creation, God's revelation, but God also comes down to Adam and basically gives him his occupation.
Yeah.
And the question then is, can Adam make sense of that occupation if God didn't come down and tell him, this is why I've made you, this is our relationship? And I'm going to, my position is no, and I think it's because God's activity with Adam is in the form of covenant. It's suzerainty. It's God's coming down and saying, look, here's your benefits.
Right.
Right. It's Genesis like 1:18 through 24, something like that. I can't remember, but when it talks about him making man, in God's image he made them, male and female he made them, and then it goes right after that. It says, and he blessed them. Okay, that's covenantal language. That's saying, okay, I'm making this covenant with you. Here's your benefits. Now you owe me these loyalties. You owe me this homage, because this is what I've given you. That in Hebrew and Christian theology, dispensable things. They're not accidental to the way that God creates the universe. The whole universe is covenantal in the nature that God has, or excuse me, in the sense that God has designed man for covenant, and that God's covenants serve an essential role.
Yeah.
So I apologize again. Like I get really ranty. Interrupt me.
No, that's fine.
But hopefully that gives kind of like basically special revelation natural revelation was never meant to be on its own. It's always meant to be in conjunction with special revelation. It's always meant to be in conjunction with God's promises, with God's covenants.
Right. But okay, so you use the example of Adam and Eve, and their special revelation was God just basically speaking to them or coming down. But for the rest of us, the only access we have to this special revelation is the Bible, correct?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So yes, in the sense, yes, in a very, but with qualification. I want to say that. Well, I'll call it on an example, right? So, like the Old Testament. There are some people who believe, I've come across it, they think the Old Testament was written down, but I'm going to agree with most biblical scholars. I think it was oral tradition.
It was oral, yeah,
for ages. So, but here's the thing: I don't think that that oral tradition started necessarily with Moses. I would not be surprised if the people of Israel had oral traditions going on long before that. And that is just to point out as an example, the concept of Adam and Eve's revelation being remnantal in all cultures throughout the world, that they had sort of a remnant, if you will, of what God had said, and that all world religions are kind of built around twisting and churning that remnantal revelation in whatever ways the culture happened to do it. That's where I would say the qualification needs to be added, that yes, the Bible is special revelation in that you're not going to find information necessary for redemption anywhere else. But on the other hand, you can't really go out into the world, out into religions, Buddhism, Islam, you cannot find no biblical truth in those religions. I don't think they can escape something of the original revelation of God, and that would include God's covenant with Adam and Eve.
Right. Okay, well, like here's what I'm getting at though. The belief in, say, the reliability of induction would require something more than natural revelation. Would you agree? It would require God telling us, you can trust that the future will be like the past. Do you think that's true?
I do, yeah.
So when it talks in Romans 1 about us understanding God, and understanding, about him through the things that have been made, that's not sufficient necessarily to get a reasonable foundation for trusting in the things that we trust in, putting faith in many of the presuppositions that constitute our properly basic beliefs. Would you agree with that? That we need more than natural revelation in order to really sufficiently justify our properly basic beliefs?
Yeah, no, I would be eager to. Yeah, that's the exact word I would use too. Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know if that was your position or not. So would you say then that because people who are non-believers, because they trust in induction, that means that they have a suppressed knowledge? They trust in induction despite claiming to not know that there's a God who promises to maintain the future as it has held in the past. Does their reluctance to acknowledge a God as the reason why they trust in what was the question I was going to ask?
Sorry.
Let's see.
I know I went on for a really long time. I apologize.
No, it's fine. Do you think that the fact that non-believers trust induction is indicative? Does that point to a knowledge of God's special revelation?
To some degree,
that God
yes.
will. It does. Okay, because I thought that special revelation could only be known through reading the scriptures, but apparently it can be known a priori without the scriptures, if what you're saying is true.
So, yeah, again, it's very difficult to put distinction there. What I would say is that the world outside Christendom, the world that is not familiar with Scripture, where it gets any kind of covenantal justification for, say, induction, is something that I think can be found in nature to an extent, and can be found in world religions to an extent. So,
could you explain how it
that's all?
Could you explain how it could be found in nature without like the question begging, assumption that because the past has remained constant, therefore the future will as well? Like, is there any non-fallacious way to infer that God will maintain the future based merely at looking around at the universe and examining its attributes?
I think that that's actually closer to the very first conversation we were having, where I was saying that I think that sort of knowledge that we have about the what's the word? The inductive principle, right? Our justification for the inductive enterprise is something that is perceived in the world.
Yeah.
The world as the predictable creation of God is the world that is seen. It is the world that is to exist. So in other words, it's just analytic to the object of knowledge that it is a reliable, understandable, predictable something that can be anticipated creation, right?
Mhm.
At least to some extent. Because again, like
Okay.
I'm not trying to say there's a, or at least I'm trying to avoid saying that there's this um, what's the word here? The line between special and natural revelation is not particularly clear.
Yeah.
Is what I'm trying to say. Like, I don't think you can give some kind of formulaic process for, okay, this counts as a natural revelation to the point where it's absolutely not involving any kind of special revelation. Like, oh, that's,
I would have thought that the demarcation would be if this fact about God is something that you could infer or realize without the Bible, then it is natural revelation. And if you need God to tell you this through text or through words or speech, then it is special revelation. That's what I would have guessed is the distinction, but maybe I'm oversimplifying it a bit.
I think you're right, but I think the difficulty to that is that in terms of God's covenant with Adam and Eve and whatever kind of remnant that people take away from that original connection with God, that would serve as a justification for the inductive principle, whatever we want to call it. And I think that would constitute special revelation. So
Sorry,
it wouldn't be special revelation in the sense.
could you say that? Could you say that one more time? Sorry.
Yeah.
I just,
No, it's fine. It's totally fine. Yeah. So I think I think you're absolutely right in that this is not a redemptive knowledge, and it's I don't think you can be consistent in the belief without an awareness of a repentance as to the things of Christ.
right.
But the difficulty there, the thing that's difficult to be subtle about is, or excuse me, the subtle thing about which it's difficult to be clear about is the fact that everyone's carrying some kind of remnantal knowledge of what was going on in the garden, of God's covenant with man there. And the problem is, well, wait a minute, doesn't that count as special revelation?
Where does that idea come from, that we have a remnantal knowledge or like a vestige of knowledge about the Adam and Eve incident? Is that in the Bible
Yeah,
somewhere?
yeah, I think so. Yeah, to an extent. I'm not sure I could. I'm trying to think of an example biblically that I could give you. There is a couple passages in the prophets. I couldn't point you to a specific one right now, or
That's okay.
if you would.
Well, you could send them to me maybe if you want to
I did
explain
that.
them later. Yeah. There was another thing before. I don't know how much time you have. Do you got like an hour left, or?
I don't. I can go till 6:20. That was
Okay. Okay, maybe we should. There's one more thing. Well, there was actually a bunch of other things I wanted to talk about, but
go for it. Yeah.
one I was more eager to talk about gets back to the conversation you were having with Alex about how, you guys had this disagreement for like the first half of the video about whether the statement, I don't know that the God of the Bible is, if the God of the Bible is transcendentally necessary, whether that necessarily entails the claim that this God is not transcendentally necessary.
Mm.
And I wanted to ask you a question about that. Let's see. Hold on just a second.
Yeah, take your time. No problem.
Okay. Oh yeah. So You were saying that, okay, I remember now what it was. Given the fact that people can have suppressed knowledge of God's existence, wouldn't you say it's true that the statement, I don't know whether God is transcendentally necessary, it necessarily implies that I don't know whether I have a suppressed knowledge of God's existence? Would you say that that's true? If somebody were to say, I don't know whether the God of Christianity is transcendentally necessary, since if that God were transcendentally necessary, it would mean that you have a suppressed knowledge of God's existence. Would you agree with that?
I think I think that what the person is intending to say, yes, does imply that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I would say, like, given the fact that people suppress what they know to be true, isn't there a sense in which it is possible for people to hesitate to believe it? Because I mean, you said at 37 minutes and 3 seconds, if my view is true, then it wouldn't be possible to hesitate to believe in it. Everybody knows that God exists if my view is true. And in fact, that knowledge is the very basis of our intellectual operations in any other state of affairs. It's that personal acquaintance with God that gives you the ability to be a human being. And so what I'm saying is, like, given the fact that people suppress what they know to be true, like, couldn't they hesitate to believe in it on that basis? And if it's possible to have like surface level reservations about the existence of the Christian God, wouldn't it be possible for somebody to know that God exists and that God is metaphysically necessary without believing that he or she knows God exists and is metaphysically necessary? And if so, doesn't the claim, I don't know if God is metaphysically necessary, doesn't that claim necessarily entail the belief that one doesn't know whether he or she has a suppressed knowledge of God's existence and metaphysical necessity? And if so, wouldn't it be the case that the claim, I don't know if God is metaphysically necessary, does not imply that God isn't metaphysically necessary? Because that was your whole disagreement with Alex, is that somebody saying, I don't know if God is metaphysically necessary, is equivalent to saying, I know that God, or I believe that God isn't metaphysically necessary. And it seems that given the ability for people to have suppressed knowledge, they could actually, that seems to negate your point, the point that you were making, is to the extent that I understand it. I hope that made sense. It was a little complicated there.
I think so. If I'm connecting the dots right. So the question is, if someone doesn't believe, and jump in and interrupt me if I'm not getting this right. The question is, if someone doesn't believe that God is epistemically necessary, the belief in God is a precondition rationality of having a sufficient epistemology, then it would follow that one believes that they are not, in fact, in a position where they're dependent on God's revelation. They don't believe that they have knowledge of God.
Right.
So then, wouldn't it follow from that someone who doesn't believe they have knowledge of God can believe that perhaps God is metaphysically necessary, but he's not epistemically necessary?
Yeah.
Was that?
Yeah.
Okay. I think, yeah, but I think that actually is the issue that I would take with that perspective, is that you have to hold, on the one hand, that you don't know God, but that would just imply that
More accurately, I
I'm
don't know. More accurately, it would be I don't know whether I know that God is transcendentally necessary or epistemically necessary.
Mm.
Like
Yeah.
saying, yeah. So the statement, I think the statement, I don't know whether God is transcendentally necessary, would have to imply that I don't know whether I have a suppressed knowledge that God is in fact transcendentally necessary. And given that, it seems to me that when somebody asks, you know, if Bonson or a precept brings up the impossibility of the contrary, and I ask, well, why should I believe that the contrary is impossible? And you respond, oh, well, since you're saying you don't believe it, or acknowledging that you don't believe that the contrary is impossible, therefore you're saying that that God, in fact, is not transcendentally necessary. I would say that that statement is false, because I'm not claiming that I don't have some kind of suppressed knowledge that God is in fact transcendentally necessary. I'm asking for the reason why I should believe that God is in fact transcendentally necessary. And it just seems like a kind of a red herring to get off on to detour on this fact that I'm claiming that it's not transcendentally necessary, when in fact I'm saying I don't know. You know, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, so let me try to correct my... So the question is, if a person is saying they don't know whether God is transcendently necessary, specifically. So it's not just, I don't know God, but it's actually, to be more clear, I don't know whether knowledge of God is a precondition of a sufficient epistemology.
Yeah, yeah.
I think the difficulty that I take with that is just that cashes out in terms of one's belief in the ability to, you know, exist and think and be human and so forth, to have a worldview, basically, apart from knowing whether God is transcendentally necessary.
What do you mean by cashes
Right?
out?
I mean that I just mean that one is already committed to the idea that knowing whether God is transcendentally necessary is itself unnecessary to one's epistemology.
Well, I could say no, because I could say I don't know whether knowing that God. What did you say? It's getting confusing.
Right.
No, I could say I don't know whether it is or not, because it gets
Right.
confusing, because we're talking about holding contrary beliefs, but just one of the beliefs is suppressed and the other is conscious or consciously aware, and so that's why it gets a little bit confusing. So that's why I'm saying I don't know that I could say that it could be the case that God is epistemically necessary, even though I'm not consciously I don't consciously believe that God is epistemically necessary. Those two aren't necessarily in contradiction if we're going to go with the idea of suppressed knowledge. We could just reject that idea altogether, but I'm just trying to play along with, you know, what the Bible says, and
Sure.
frankly, I kind of think there's an extent to which we as human beings can have suppressed knowledge, or we can let our desires influence our beliefs to an extent that there might be some subconscious level at which we don't believe something, but a conscious level at which we do. So I think when we incorporate all that, it becomes difficult to say that just because somebody says, I don't know whether God is transcendentally or epistemically necessary, therefore that entails the belief that God isn't. Given this dual belief or dual knowledge, it seems like that rebuttal doesn't work, but I don't know.
Well, yeah. So not to deflect here, let me see if I can't play this out by implication.
Okay.
If it were the case that you were committed to the position, or that someone was committed to the position that they didn't know whether God, excuse me, was transcendentally necessary, right? That he's epistemically necessary. wouldn't that imply that knowledge state, whether God's epistemically necessary, is itself not necessary?
Could you say that one more time?
Yeah. If someone is committed to the position that knowledge about whether God is epistemically necessary is not something they have, that they do not possess knowledge whether or not God is epistemically necessary. If that's their position.
I mean, I could go along with that, but it's not really concordant with what I'm saying. I'm saying I don't know whether I know that God exists, because if I did know God exists, I would just have that knowledge would be suppressed. It wouldn't be available to my conscious psyche. And the same goes for whatever knowledge I might have about God's epistemic or metaphysical necessity. So you might have to adjust that first part a little bit to incorporate the fact that I don't know. So, say it one more time, and let's see if we can reword it to make it work, to make it more.
Yeah, feel free to adjust it, because I'm not trying to. I'm just trying to make sure I have the.
That's fine.
Okay, so that I phrased it was, if you are committed to the belief that you do not know whether God is, well, excuse me, whether.
How about, let's say this: I'm committed to the belief that I might or might not know.
Okay.
What if you to say that?
Okay. So, if you're committed to the belief that you might or might not know, you believe you might not know.
Sorry, it cut out there right when you said that. Could you repeat?
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so if you are committed to the belief that you might or might not know,
yeah,
that God is that's the
yeah.
Wouldn't it follow then that knowledge about whether God is epistemically necessary is itself unnecessary?
No, I don't think it would. The only way it would follow,
really,
is if I could rule out the possibility that I do know. Because, see, if I don't know whether I know that God is epistemically necessary, then I can't say that God isn't epistemically necessary, because for all I know, the only reason I'm able to think and process the information you're saying right now is because God is in fact epistemically necessary, and that I've suppressed that belief. But since I don't know whether I have suppressed that belief, I don't know whether I hold that belief, I'm not in a place to say that God isn't epistemically necessary. So that's why I would say I don't think that implies, I don't think that logically follows. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think the rub is that I don't. In other words, I think that you're actually pointing out the problem that I take with this, with agnosticism, basically, right? That the point of view of indifference about knowledge of God or properties of that knowledge in this case, and that is that I think it implies to when you say. Sorry, I want to make sure I don't misrepresent you here. Okay.
Sorry.
You do not know whether, or excuse me, you believe that it may or may not be the case that knowledge of God is epistemically necessary.
Yeah.
Okay, that would imply that you believe it's possible that knowledge of God is not epistemically necessary, right?
Right. But that belief that it's possible that God is not epistemically necessary might be in conflict with a suppressed knowledge that God is in fact epistemically necessary. And if that's the case, then I would just be wrong. But since on my conscious level, I haven't yet acquired any kind of knowledge or information on which I can make a judgment about whether that's the case. And so I have to remain in this state of uncertainty as to whether that is the case.
Okay. I guess that is what I am trying to suppose that my argument follows through, right? Suppose that it's incoherent to suggest indifference or neutrality or belief in the possibility of the non-transcendental necessity of this knowledge.
Suppose that it's inherent to hold. Sorry, say that again. Incoherent.
That was the word. Yeah. So suppose that it's as I'm holding that it is. Suppose for a moment that it is incoherent.
Yeah. Okay.
That belief, right? That it's possible this knowledge is not epistemically necessary, and it's also possible that it is.
Yeah.
Okay. If that's incoherent, then that just would be itself the impetus for thinking that either biting the bullet and saying, okay, well then I must not have knowledge of God because here I am talking about not knowing whether or not this knowledge is epistemically necessary, but I don't have such knowledge. Or biting the bullet the other way and saying, well, wait a minute, I don't actually have grounds to do that, so it must be the case that I have.
Yeah, so I guess the question would be, is it incoherent, and what reason is there to think so? Because I think I agree with you.
Okay, so go ahead, sorry.
Oh no, that's it. I was just I was wondering how you would go about. I'm wondering what I said that's incoherent, or how the position I've put forward is incoherent.
Right. I'm trying to think of how to do this in a way that's going to make it as clear as possible. Say a position, what we mean by incoherence. Tell me if you would agree with this definition or this criterion. That a view is incoherent where it entails, by its very nature, belief in two mutually exclusive propositions.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that your view does, in that same way, by its nature, entail belief in two mutually exclusive.
Well, yeah, of course you do, because I mean, you believe that I in fact do have a knowledge of God, and that on a conscious level, I don't believe that God is epistemically necessary, where on a subconscious level, perhaps I do. But what I'm asking is, what reason is there for me? How do we get through to that conscious part of my brain and help me connect the conscious part of my brain with the subconscious? How do we actually demonstrate that I in fact, it seems to me that the only way to show that my belief set here is incoherent is to show that I in fact do have a suppressed knowledge that not only that God exists, and that this God is epistemically and metaphysically necessary. Would you agree that the only way to show that my belief set is incoherent would be to show that I in fact do hold two contrary beliefs? One belief that is a suppressed knowledge of God's metaphysical necessity, and the other is a conscious knowledge, or conscious belief, I should say, that I don't know whether, that I'm not consciously aware of, in other words, any reason to think that God is in fact metaphysically necessary. Would you agree that you would have to actually do some demonstrating at this point in order to show the incoherence of my position?
I would totally agree that it needs to be demonstrated, the incoherence, but I actually don't think that I don't think that the argument revolves around whether I can, so to speak, bring to the surface the suppression of this knowledge.
Okay.
I think it actually just has to do with showing that simplicator, there's two mutually exclusive propositions. And I think I didn't do a very good job of being clear with, that's why I'm not going to do the same thing this time. But the reason I brought up things like the green apple, or random objects with Malpass is because I don't think that this problem is unique to Christian theism. I don't think that this theology of rebellious unacknowledgement of God's revelation is actually relevant to this problem. I think it's relevant to this problem indirectly, in the sense that, okay, this is why this happens, but it's not necessary to explain why this happens, to point out that it is incoherent. Does that make sense?
No, but that's not necessarily your fault. It's probably, I have ADD, so sometimes I'll get fixated on one thing that a person says, and then I kind of lose track of the rest. So sorry, I didn't quite catch what you meant there.
It's totally fine. Yeah, and I always go on way too long. Let me see if I can't. Let me see if I can't actually try to demonstrate incoherence.
Okay.
Because I think the summary of everything I just said there was, I don't think I actually have to refer to suppressed knowledge to do that. I don't think I need to invoke that. That theology. The incoherence occurs, I think, where, in order to make sense of, in order to be consistent in saying, I do not believe that knowledge of God is epistemically necessary, it therefore follows that you believe it is possible to have beliefs without believing that knowledge of God is epistemically necessary.
Epistemically possible, not metaphysically possible. Just to be clear.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. But that would constitute itself negation of the epistemic necessity of knowledge of God, because you would then have a knowledge state that does not depend, that is not contingent upon that knowledge transaction, the divine knowledge transaction.
I would have a knowledge state. The knowledge state is the belief that I don't know whether God is transcendentally necessary. Is that the knowledge state you're referring to?
No. I'm referring to knowledge of the epistemic necessity of revelation, right? The epistemic necessity of knowledge of God.
Okay.
Let me see if I can put it another way.
Okay.
In order to believe, I'll put it in argument form. I think in order to believe that you do not know whether the knowledge of God is transcendentally necessary.
In order to believe that I might know. Right.
You might, right, yeah. But you may not also.
Okay.
Right. So in other words, in order to believe that you're not, let's put it this way, in order to believe that you're possibly not knowledgeable of the epistemic necessity of knowledge of God, you would then have to know that you could be in that state apart from said knowledge. But that would just be to have knowledge apart from the epistemic necessity of knowledge of God.
Okay. Here's what I'll do. I'll go back and I'll listen to this, and I'll listen to what you just said, and I'll think about it, because I'm not quite understanding it, but I might just need to, re-listen to it. And did you record this, by the way?
Yeah, it's still
okay,
on.
Great.
Yeah.
And maybe we can have a follow-up discussion, because it's about 6:23 right now, and you said you had to go.
Yeah.
So
I do, unfortunately.
Yeah, I didn't quite catch that, but I'm not saying it didn't make sense. I'm just I've had 3 beers so far, and so I'm probably not in condition to understand
Well,
anyway. So
it makes you feel better. I got 2 hours of sleep, so I could be
yeah.
messing up some stuff too. So.
All right. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and there's still a lot more I'd love to talk about sometime in the future. I'm glad we finally made it work.
Me too. Thanks for coming on, Chad.
Yeah. Do you want to just? I'm thinking. I imagine you're probably not going to upload this to your channel.